Welcome to a breakdown of my latest VR Game Jam submission called Reflections. This is the second in a two-part series, and in this video I'll be going down how I actually built the foundations for the game, how I create these titles with hand blends, etc. very quickly. And within the next hour you'll basically learn how to do that. And you can imagine if you get good at this, within half an hour you can have your hands blending and you can actually be interacting with objects in your scene, and that's your foundation to start building your interaction game. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, we're going to start off with creating a brand new Unity project. Here I'm using 2023-20 F1 and I'm going to be using the Universal Render Pipeline package, and we're going to call our project Game Jam Startup just for this video. Okay, so when the project starts up, you'll have the default scene that comes with the URP package, which is this here. All good. I suggest you have a play with this at some point if you're new to URP or you're new to Unity, because it's got some nice assets in here that you can play with, you can move around and tweak to your heart's desire, etc. and play with. So we're not going to need any of this, so we're going to get rid of half of the stuff in here. Now, the only reason I actually start up with this URP package is it sets all the settings, and in a game jam you want to be pretty quick with how you do things. Now, as I delete this stuff and it reloads the assemblies, etc., you'll notice that my layout might be a bit different. If you're new to Unity, you can move these tabs around. This is how I have it set up to do my recording, so I can drag up the animation window, the console window, etc. And I have my project set to just show the small icons, as it were, rather than having the big icons everywhere in the big folders. So that's just how it is. You can change your layout, and I use the dark mode because I work in the dark most of the time. But let's get into the project. So I will create, to start off with, a main scene, which is where we'll base a lot of our stuff in. And there we go, main, and we'll jump to that. And we don't want to save the sample. So there we go, we got rid of all the sample assets. We still have all the URP settings in there, and we got our main scene set up. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the project settings, because this is going to be an XR project. So let's jump in here and install the XR management system. And we just let that resolve and get the packages ready. Cool, and there it is. Okay, so we're gonna want to put this out on Oculus and OpenXR. You can choose what you want to do, but that's how I'm gonna do it. So we'll install the Oculus. And this is just installing plugins in the background, which will come under your packages if you're ever curious about that. Okay, set it OpenXR. And also we're going to be doing the Android section. If you've installed Unity and you haven't installed the Android package that comes with it, you can go back into the Unity Hub and select the Android option from the install, and that will actually give you the Android. And this will enable me to be setting up the Android system to pump out to the Oculus Quest separately from the direct from computer. Now this usually comes up about the input system. Now, yep, we want to change over to the new input system, so we press yes on there. And it'll actually restart Unity. Okay, so we've got Oculus and OpenXR set up on the PC, and we've got Oculus set up there. Next thing to do is jump into the OpenXR, make sure we're on PC, and set up some profiles that we want to have for our controllers. So I'm just going to select here to have the Oculus, the Valve, and the Vive. Because they're the headsets I have in my office. Okay, and in the Android section, I'm going to set up the Oculus, and that's it. So I'll save the project here, because sometimes these things don't save and then you lose them. And that is the XR settings set up. And you'll see here, we've got some general settings, etc., ready to go. So let's jump to the main scene. Now, one thing we want to do to be quite quick with building for our game jam, because we've only got 72 hours or at worst 24 hours. If you're lucky, you'll have a 10-day jam or a month jam. But let's get some sample assets so that we can actually get the connections all set up without actually having to do it ourselves, basically cheating. If we go to our package manager and we go to OpenXR plugin and we pump down to samples, you'll see there's actually a controller section here. Now, if we import that, you might have to download it, but I already had it downloaded. And we come into this new folder called samples that's set up here, and we look at controller sample. What you'll see, if you pop down, just does a little bit of a boot, is all the buttons, etc., in a little UI here. And what this has done is it's actually created as a player rig with all these visible elements, grip arm, all the rest. And if you actually were to run this and you started using controllers, you'd see all the axis moving, etc. We're not going to do that now because we don't need to, but it's very handy that we have this player rig already and also the event system set up. So that's why I do it. It's a way to cheat. You can get your stuff done really quickly. So let's select both the player rig and the event system. We'll copy those and we'll go over to our main and we'll stick them into here. Now, as I said, let's shrink these gizmos because they're huge. There we go. So as I said, we won't be actually using these elements here, but I like to leave them on just so if you want to see them, you can play with them. We'll leave the grip alive, and I'll show you that in a minute once we've got our avatar start setting up. So we just actually hide all those bits because we won't need those at the moment, but I like to leave them there when I'm developing to start off with, simply because if something's going wrong with the input system, I can actually turn these back on and make sure the input's actually connecting up to the items. So it's always a good reason to let that stay. Now what we're going to do next after we've saved main is we're actually now going to create our avatar. And to do this, we actually launch the Mixamo website and we pull down an avatar from there. It's, again, a good free resource to actually create an avatar where your hands and etc. are available. So let's do that now. Okay, so I'm on the Mixamo site, and as you can see here, here's a character. I'm logged in. You need to create a free account for this, but why not? It's free. And there are plenty of animations you can actually download from Mixamo, which I've used in the past for game jams. Again, it's a free asset that anybody can get to. So when you list it on the assets you've used on your website, on your itch site for the download, people can actually come in and they can do the same thing because they know where the assets are coming from. So that's why I always think it's a good idea. Now here I've got the default avatar. This is the guide that you'll probably notice the head shape from if you've seen the game that I created for the VR Super Jam. And we're going to be using this guy here. So let's download him. I actually like to select the FBX for Unity. And T-pose is fine. I'm not selecting an animation here because I don't need one because this is going to be us in the actual game. So let's press download. It prepares for download. And it's downloaded. Ybot FBX. So now I'm going to drag this FBX into a folder in my Unity scene. So let's do that. If I open up Unity and I'm in here and I close this down. Now I like to keep all my content nice and neat and I like to keep it in a content folder. And preferably, I like to capitalize the front of it. There we go. And what I'll do is I'll create a folder under here called model, and then I'll create a folder under here called avatar. Now, this might seem like, why am I putting in so much depth? But we fill this out as the project goes on with textures, animations, etc. So what I'm going to do now is drag the FBX you just saw there into there. So I'm going to show in Explorer. You can't see that because it's off page, but I'll come into here and I'll drag that into my folder. And if I come back into here, you can see, there you go, Ybot01. And I'm just going to rename that to avatar. Now, the next thing we want to do is we don't actually want to use this avatar fully. As you can see here, why bother having all the head and all the ligaments and all the joints and everything set up? We actually only really want this head shape and we want these hand shapes. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually take this into a 3D modeling program, in my case Maya, and I'm going to chop the head off and I'm going to chop the hands but keep the joints in the hands intact. And that way I can keep this character going. Now I use Maya, it's what I came up with through Sony, etc., building tools for. So you can choose Blender, most of them do the same thing. So let's get into Maya and do that. So here I am in Maya. I've dragged in my character. Here we go. And we can see that we have all of his bones, etc. We can actually make this wireframe so you can see this. There's all the bones all the way through the character. And we have the actual surfaces itself, all set up as little spheres, etc. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to chop this guy up now. But first, I'm going to save this off, just in case I ever want to come back and do extras to it. So we'll save the scene as, and I'm actually going to put this into the same folder that I have my other avatar in Unity. No particular reason, just for neatness. So there we go, it's saved. Now the next thing to do is to start chopping them up. So let's select the head here. We'll do some faces. We'll expand out to take the entirety of that face, and I'm going to chop that off by separating it. See if I can find the thing, separate. There we go. So now I've got the head itself. Now I also like to actually have the neck as well in this one. So let's take the face here. We'll do the same thing. And we'll separate that off. There we go. So I've actually now got two parts. I've got this and I've got the head, so the polysurface and the polysurface. Right, now I actually want to bring this neck a little bit up. I actually think it's a little bit low in this scene. So let's actually move it up. Now, obviously I'll be moving the positions and everything in a second, but we move this up and we'll combine this into a single one, and I'll be calling this head. And for good measure, let's delete all the history behind that so we can get rid of all the connections, etc. Okay, so that is the head. It's on its own, it's not connected to any joints, and it's good to go. But I don't like it being all the way up here. So what we're going to do is, if you see, once we move it, it starts really coming down. If we were to bring that straight into Unity, what would happen is that would be way off center, and that would be super annoying to play with. So we bring this down, put it to about middle there. We might have to do some adjustments in Unity, but we get it to about middle. Happy with that. There's nothing in there, nothing in there. And in this program, in Maya, we have the ability to freeze the transforms. If you need to, you might need to come into here and make sure they're all selected, but we freeze these transforms, and there we go. Now the center, the pivot point, everything is in the center of the head. So that's great. We'll save that, our progress there, and we'll export this head again. I don't know why it always resets to the scenes. I think I've got to set up my project for that, but I'm not going to do that now. It's the time. So I'm just going to export that as the head. And by the way, if anything I do here is confusing or anything like that, I know I speak quite quickly when I do tutorials. I'm not a teacher. So if anything is a little bit confusing, do put something in the comments and I will come back and answer those for you and try and help you out the best I can within time. Okay, so the next thing to do is we want the hand, this little puppy here. It's got all these lovely joints in it set up, so we won't have to play with those when we're actually in the scene in Unity, or we won't have to create this hand model or anything like that, so we want this joint system. So what we'll do is we'll come into here, we'll select this joint, okay, and if we come down to here, we'll see we're down in here, left hand, etc. So we come into Rigging and we disconnect joint. Done. And now the joint is separate, the hand is separate, all good. Okay, so let's just undo that because we want it back in the position. Now we want to get rid of all this because we don't need any of it. So let's come in, we will select some faces. Let's just, there's probably a quicker way of doing this. Oh, I've messed up. We're going to get rid of this system first because we don't need any of that. There we go. We still have our joint for our hand. And now we just got to get rid of all these parts of the model. One of the quickest ways of doing this is hiding this joint system so we don't keep selecting it. Right, let's look at the faces. Okay, if we select these faces here, that's great, because now we can go into select and we can inverse. Hey, all of those. Don't need any of that. Get rid of that. Okay, and I like the little ball joints that sit between the fingers. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set the face to these, and we'll do a big selection, and boom, it's gone. Right, so now we have the hand. And if I go into the object and, turn this to object, and we pick these bits out. They've got some funny names, but that's fine. And what we'll do is we'll combine those. Oh, I'm in rigging. I need to be in modeling. And we'll combine these up, and now we've got it called spine. That's really weird. Let's call it hand. And if we show the joints, hopefully, if everything's gone correctly, if we just test, there we go. The joints are still affecting all the items in there. We have a free hand with all the joints set up. Excellent. And it's called left hand, which is weird because we just want to call it hand for now. Okay. Excellent, and it still works. It's waving. Right, okay, so the next thing to do is actually, again, move this down to the position we want it in. So if we come into here and we start moving it about, then we'll see if we come down to here, boom, it's in the position we want. Now, best thing to do here is just delete some history of these because we won't be needing any of that, and you'll see all the old transforms remove. Just double check. I like to double check this stuff because sometimes we lose it. There we go, we lost it. Okay, so to get it back, what we'll do is we'll simply bind the hand again to the bones. So we come up here, we bind the skin, and we're bound. Okay, cool. There we go. It's back together. Now, obviously, you'll want to reweight this and everything if you were doing a real hand, but because our hand is made up of all these sort of balls and everything, we haven't really got any deformation going, so that's perfectly fine for what we need it for. So let's select both of these items, and we're going to export our selection, and we're going to export it as the hand. There we go, and that's done. Right, save this project, and let's dive back into Unity. So here's Unity. Cool. And we've got our hand and we've got our head. Now we're not going to use the full avatar, so we'll get rid of that guy. And here's our head. Hey. We won't do with the head itself. We're not going to use that on the player because it will get in the way and we'd have to do like culling and etc. But when you look at the game, you'll see there's actually an avatar looking at you as a reflection. So that actual character in front, they have heads. So that's where the head comes in. But we're not going to use it in this instance. So let's get rid of that. What we do need is we need the hand. And here's the hand. And the hand has all these lovely joint systems. Whee! Wonderful. And that's what we need to start off with. So the next step is to get this hand interacting. So the first pose we want to create with our hand is the default idle pose. And this will be the one that you basically see when you come into the scene itself. And it will be the one where it looks like you're kind of gripping the controller. Now I like to have the sort of idle animations and idle poses when I'm doing VR as one that looks around the controller, because you can feel your hands outside of your vision, and you know that they're gripping a controller, so it's quite nice to have them gripped. Now that depends from game to game and the sort of hands that you're actually got listed up, but with this game that's what I'm going to do. Now to do that and to make it look realistic, what I do is I actually bring in a model of the Oculus controller, and you can find these on the Oculus site that you can actually download. So I'm going to drag and drop a controller that I've downloaded from the Oculus site into this controller folder. And if I do that, I'm just doing it, just moving it off screen there. There we go. So as it comes in, we'll bring in the Oculus Rift controller. And as I say, these are just basically the controller that you can get downloaded from Oculus. And it will just help us set up to get it nice and positioned. Okay, so if we drag this controller in, there it is. Fantastic. Okay, and if we look where we're facing, that's the Z. So we want to be facing around that sort of angle. And we want to take the hand and we want to blend this hand around this item. So if I rotate this and then bring this back around here and come back here, there we go. So I'll get it roughly in position there. I'll turn the gizmos off for this because I don't need to see the camera on there. And I'll just select the hand and press focus. That's the F key just to get it nice and close. And that's about where we want it. Okay, so let's start posing the hand. First thing to do is select the parent, chuck in an animator. Oh, there you go, it's very excited. And we'll create a folder to be nice and neat, and we'll call this animations, and we'll create another folder under there to say we're going to be putting it in hand. We'll create the animator controller, and we'll call this the hand controller. And this will actually be dragged and dropped into here. So we've got our controller, which is our animator here, and we've got it on our hand itself. Now we're going to want to create an animation on here, and this is where you come in and you select hand all the way down, and you'll put into here that you're going to have idle, and you'll see the idle animation come up into there. Okay, now the animations we're going to create here are actually poses, so they're single frame animations, and then we let the Mechanim system actually do the blending for us, which is quite neat. So the first thing to do is make sure this hand is really in a position we're comfortable with. Now, what I like to do off of Unity is basically come in and make sure that when I hold the controller in my hand, it kind of looks similar to the way the controller is held here. So if you notice, the actual index finger here is ready to wrap around the trigger, and the other fingers are ready to wrap around the grip itself. Now we might want to bring this back a little bit. There we go. So we're going to get this nice and neat there. Now this doesn't have to be perfect. It is a game jam, but try and get it as close as possible in this. I could spend ages on this, and I do when I'm doing all my full games, because getting it nice and neat really sells that sort of interaction and immersion. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start recording, but you want to make sure that hand is in the right position, and so is the model, because we don't want to be repositioning the hand, because then it looks weird if it's moving around on you. So the only animations we want to change are the fingers, because again, if the hand animation moves, then your hand is stationary in the virtual world, but the hand is moving your hand in the real world, sorry, is stationary, but your hand is moving in the virtual world, and that just breaks immersion straight off the bat. So we only want to change the fingers and thumbs. So the first thing to do is move this thumb. It's in a really weird position, so we're just going to move this down a little bit here, and we'll come down and we'll just move this guy in here. Obviously, I'm going to do this quite quickly. Even in the game jam, I do this a little bit quicker. A little bit slower, and work my way through it. So let's come into the index finger, and we'll wrap this index finger around, and we'll wrap the background, and we'll make sure it's going to be in a nice position. Just move it down a bit. There we are, and come round to about there. Now we're actually going to do some finger blends. So when we press the index finger, this button will actually come in. So we want to make sure that this isn't completely on the trigger itself, but it's pretty close. So it's quite nice. We'll move that back in a little bit. Oh, no, not like that. We'll rotate that back in, and there we go. That will do for now. Okay, so the middle, pinky, and the ring finger we'll bring down here. Here we go. Make sure they look all right. And then let's do their children. Oh, missed one. There we go, and their children's children. And we'll just move those in there. There we go. Okay, so that's a very basic idle pose, but it looks quite good, and we've got all of our frames down in this single frame here. All of our points in this single frame down here. So let's stop recording. So that's all good. So the next thing we want to do is, as we've got our idle set up, we actually want to have it so that we move the fingers when things go off. And what I've just noticed is this thumb is actually a little bit in. So let's record that and pull that out a little bit so it doesn't look so weird clipping into the actual item. And we'll turn it a little bit, get it a little bit neater. There we go. That'll do. Okay, let's stop that. Right, now, when we press our trigger, we actually want this finger to move backwards and press the trigger. And we actually want this to do a little blend pose in here. And we can do that in the animator, which is quite neat. But the first thing to do is to create the framed pose itself. So let's turn off the preview. We'll grab all the frames in the idle and we'll copy that. Oh, I don't know why there's a frame there, but we can move that frame back because that should have never been there. There we go. Right, so we'll grab the frames if we can. Let's just do it. Okay, now we copied that. We'll create a new clip, and I'm going to call this index finger. Okay, we'll paste that. And what we want to do is we don't actually want to affect anything but the index finger. So we get rid of all the animations apart from this index. Now if we pose, you'll notice everything else doesn't pose. But this is because we're going to make an addition, an override onto the actual animator itself and move this back and forth. But we don't want it to be there. We actually want it to be pressing down the trigger. So make sure you're on the first frame. Right click, not right click, press the record. And then move, oh no, we want to make sure we're pressing on the index. I don't know why I was doing that. There we go. And we want to move this down a bit and in a bit. And there we go. That's actually pressing onto the trigger. Perfect. Okay, so let's turn off the record, take off preview, and that goes back. Now the next thing to do is to set up our animator so it does the blending. Now what we'll do is we'll create an empty state here, and this will be our idle on our layer. So let's set this as idle here. Okay, and the next thing to do is create a blend tree. There we go. And this blend tree is going to have our index posing happening in it. But we'll want to actually come out of idle and go into this blend tree. So we'll create a transition here, and we'll want to go back. So we'll create a transition here. Now, when we press the index button on our controller, we actually do a 0 to 1 motion coming in from the input. So we want to do the same thing here. And to do that, we actually create a parameter. Now this has automatically created a blend parameter on here when we created the blend node, but we're going to call it index. And if we come into the blend tree and look at the blend tree, there you go. There's our index in here. Now coming back out, our transition that we want to do is we don't want to do it on time, but we actually want to use index, and we want to say if it's greater than a specified amount, and that specified amount is actually 0.1 because we're doing the trigger. And what this will do is it will say that when the trigger has been depressed more than 0.1, it will actually translate into this transition into this particular blend tree. And what we want to do is we want to have the reverse as well. So when it's less than 0.1, we want to come out of this blend tree and go back into idle. So in our blend tree, we have this here. We want to add 2 states. Okay, so we're going to blend from one state to another state. And that last state is going to be our index finger. Okay, and that is actually going to be where this index finger is down here. And you can see this in this nice, neat little preview window that we've got here. But here's the thing. We need to have it blend from something. Okay, so what we do is we're going to actually call a new animation called index idle. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll jump back into here, and to do this, nice and simple, go back into idle, copy that, create a new animation, and call it index idle. We'll paste that, and again, we only want to do any animations on the index finger. So we'll get rid of everything else except that. Now in the animator, we come back in, we have our blend, and we go from index idle to index finger. Now, again, we can actually do our little motion. And down here, let's see it happen. It's subtle, but it's there. And if you watch the video of the game itself, you'll notice this happening when you press the index finger, and it just gives a little bit more immersion. Now, in our particular game, we're not firing guns or anything like that. In fact, we're not actually using the index finger to shoot anything. But what I like to see in these games is when you're in there and you're playing away, you want every sort of button press they do to have some sort of interaction in the world, to give it that sort of sense of immersion. So I always put in the trigger and I always put in the grip fingers. It's just, call it force of habit. Now, you might use those. Let's say you're holding a gun. You've got a character and she's going to shoot all these other characters in the scene. Now, when you're holding that gun, maybe you're doing it gangster style, you're holding it sideways or whatever, but you will see the finger and you could actually blend that finger through to actually show it pulling the trigger of the gun. So it just gives it that extra sense of immersion. So let's do the same thing, but let's do it for the grip now. So if we jump back into the scene and we go back to our idle and we just preview it, there's all our fingers. Now we want these to come in like they're pressing the grip button. And again, we're doing this quite quickly. In a game, I would actually have this set up a lot better. So we come back in, we're going to create a new clip. And this one I'm going to call grip fingers. There we go. Now make sure you've copied the first frame of that. You've come into grip and you've pressed this. Now we don't want to use the index finger on this. And we want to only be doing the middle, thumb, ring, and pinky. And that's grip fingers. Now, while we're here, we're also we're going to actually move these into position. So let's start recording. Now we've got our pinky, our ring, and not our thumb. We want our middle finger. There we go. And we want to actually bring these in a bit. There we go. That's all we need. That's everything we need. So cancel that. And while we're here, we'll create another clip. We'll copy the idle and we'll do our grip idle. So let's come into here, like we did with our index. Come to here, grip idle. And we paste these down and we don't want the index finger, so off it goes. Job done. And actually, while we're here, we don't want to have the thumb in these either. So let's go back into grip fingers and we'll remove the thumb as well. Done. Okay, so that's that done. Let's go into the animator and we can create that up. Now in parameters like the index, we create a float and we call it grip. And we come back to the layers and we add into here a layer called grip. Again, remember override, one weight. In here, we'll set up an empty. This will be our idle state. And then we'll set up a blend. We'll make some transitions to and from this blend. Oh, it's not letting me do it. There it goes. Okay, we're not going to use the exit state, but we are going to use the grip, and we're going to do greater than 1, and we're going to do less than 1. There we go. And we make sure we're not using times on either. Jump into the blend tree, create 2 motion fields, and select the grip idle and the grip fingers. Now we also want to make sure the parameter is grip. So when we press the grip button and we send the details 0 to 1 to grip on the animator, this will happen. And if we're just looking at the preview and we bring that up and we run the grip, there we go. Little fingers moving along. And again, not perfect, but for this demonstration, it will do the job. You can spend as much time as you want working on it. Now, to be nice and tidy with this, we'll come into base layer, because what you'll notice on base layer is actually it throws in all the animations onto here. And we're going to put some other animations in here in a bit. So we'll clear this off for now. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is get these parameters being set in the animator. And that we're going to do some scripting. So first, we'll jump back to the scene. Let's get rid of the controller for now. We'll just simply hide the controller because we might want it for reference later on. Now we want to start putting this stuff into place. So here is the left hand, here is the grip. And that grip is actually moved. It's tracked in the world by this tracked pose driver. And we want to utilize that. So when we move our controller in the real world, this hand will move with it. Okay, so the thing to do is we take our hand and controller and we drag it up into there. And now that hand is actually under that item. So when the tracked poser moves, the hand moves too. Okay, so let's get scripting. What we'll do is we'll create a folder called scripts, and I'm going to create a folder under here called avatar. And under avatar, I'm going to create a new C# script, and I'm going to call that script hand. And it puts in all the various gumph. And then under hand, we will drag and drop this. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually take some of the stuff that's already been created for us. So if you come into trigger press, etc., you'll see that there's these actioned button scripts, and this is all added in our samples pack. And we're going to utilize these action references to get the references from the input and put them into our hand animator. So let's open up our script. Okay, so we've opened up our script and here it is. I use dark mode, sorry about that if you prefer it light, but that's how I like it. Now we won't be needing any collections or anything like that, but we will be using the Unity engine input system because we'll want to receive input. Okay, the next thing to do is actually those nodes that I showed you that come with the package, we want to take the input action reference into our actual item here, into our class. So we create a serialized field. I like to always create a tooltip. I use them as comments, then I can see them in the inspector and outside. And for this, I'm actually going to put the input for the trigger, and I'll just put 0 to 1 there. And we're going to create an input action reference. There we go. And we're going to name it something nice like trigger action reference. There we are. We'll set that to null. Okay. And we'll also want to do this for the grip. So let's just copy and paste because we're lazy. Grip. And we'll put grip in there and we'll realize we did that wrong because that should be input for the grip. Okay, now we're going to do this on the animator we have. So let's make sure we can actually collect our animator. So let's put that in here. And what we'll do is we'll get rid of this start function for now, and update for now. We'll come to those in a moment. But we're going to create an awake function, which will be called by Unity, and we're going to get our animator. There we are. Okay, so we're getting our animator. Now what I like to do is when I'm doing this sort of thing is I know that I'm going to have an animator in it. I know I want it. So basically I set it as a require component. Now this is an attribute that Unity provides that enables us to make sure that where we put our hand component, the animator component exists as well. Okay, so we've got our animator. We're going to be setting our references here, but we're going to be processing this input because we're going to be setting it into the animator itself. Now, what we do is we do that in our update. So let's jump in here, come into update, and we're going to process our input. Now, I'm going to do this as a separate function because I don't want to actually be copying and pasting the process input. So let's call process input here. And we're actually going to be taking in the input action reference, and we're going to be providing out a float for the return. So we'll check that off there, and we'll want to check that this input action reference is, it's coming in. So we'll want to check that it's not null. So our input action reference does not equal null, and also that our input action reference dot action does not equal null. Okay, cool. Now, the input action reference action provides us the functionality to read the value from the input, and that will be read as a float. Ta-da! And we'll be returning that. But obviously, if we don't actually have that, or we're not getting the reference or anything, we'll just return 0 for now. Now you could store that and return what you've stored from previous so it doesn't drop back to 0, but for now we're just going to return to 0. Now we're going to want to set that to be our grip button and our trigger button. So we're going to use these for both. So we'll do some storage in here. So we're going to do this and we're going to go grip button 0F, and also we're going to want to get our trigger button equals 0F. Okay, so our trigger button will get process input, and then we'll provide in here the trigger action reference, and the same for the grip button. So the grip button, process the input, and we'll get the grip action reference. Ta-da! So that's going to provide, that's going to go in, get from the input system, and actually fill out this trigger button and this grip button value. That's wonderful. But we're now going to want to set that on a pose. Because if we go back to Unity, then we can actually see that we've got to set our animator here, and in our animator we've got these two values here that we want to set. So jump back into the Visual Studio, and what we'll do is we'll set this pose. So in the animator, we want to set a float, and we want to set what's in there. So in this case, index, and we want to set the index to whatever the trigger button is giving us. And the same for the grip. Now I'm going to show you something a little bit more advanced in Unity. What happens here is actually we're passing in this string every time to this float, and we're doing it in the update, and that just is ugly to me. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of indexes to send to this instead of actually these strings. So if I come up here, I'll create a read only, I'll create it as an int, and then we'll set here an animator index parameter, and animator has this great little function called string to hash, and this takes in that string, and then what that does is that gives us the ID that we can provide. So instead of this, we're actually passing an int, and that's so much nicer. So let's do the same for the grip, and we'll do the grip here, and that's it. That is our script done. That will now process the input and send it out to our animator. So if I save that and I come back out into our scene, we get two exposed references. Okay, now we want to fill these in. Now, luckily for us, these are already done. We'll be able to pick out the items from here. So if we come into things like trigger press and we press on this one here, we can see that this is all set up for us. How nice, how neat for them. So in hand, we want to use the grip and we want to use the trigger. And I've done that wrong because I've selected the right. You want to select the left because we're doing the left hand. Okay, so make sure you pick out the right ones when you're doing this. Okay, so before we start testing, let's just double check we've got everything set up. So we have the hand, we have the triggers set up on that from the input system. We have our base layer, we have our index, and our index is going from index greater than 1 to the blend, and index is less than 1 to come back. And then for the grip, we're in here, and we're going grip is greater than 1, and we go, oh, good catch, grip is less than 1 to come out of that one. So there we go. So that's our grip, that's our index, and we're ready to test. Now before we run this, if I was to run as it were, then I'd actually be looking at myself quite far away because we still have the main camera from the original scene. So let's delete that because we have our main camera under our head here. So let's press play and see what happens. So we got it running. Here's our hand. Here's our hand. And if we press the index button, there's the movement from 0 to 1. And that's the full blend there that you can see. And if we press our grip button, that's the 0 to 1 on our grip button. So that is how you make little blends. So now if I'm moving around and I'm doing things, I can actually see that the hand is moving, and it gives that little bit of extra immersion. Okay, so now we've seen it all running and we've got our little bit of immersion. What we want to do next is actually do some hand posing, and this is where we get our interaction. So if you've watched the game, you'll see that when I move my hand close to the cube or the markers, the hand will actually manipulate into a pointer pose where it's pointing at the marker. That means that we've got a very small area of interaction so we can get that fine detail movement, that fine motor movement in what we're doing. So that's what we're going to do next. So to do that, we'll need a cube. So if we close off the left hand for now, and we don't want to create an empty object, we want to create a 3D object, a cube, which isn't visible. Oh, there it is. It's huge. We certainly don't want it to be that big. We're going to shrink that up, and we're going to make that around about 1. Is 1 good? 1 seems good. Okay, and we'll bring that back to here. Okay, now I'm not going to do any fancy rendering or anything like you see in the game. You can do all that yourselves, and you can download shaders and play with that. All I'm going to do is show you how to actually pose when interacting with an object. Okay, so we've got our cube here, but what we want to do is as this hand enters this cube area, we want to pose it. Not when it touches the cube, but when it enters the area. So let's set that up. So what we want to do is we want to create underneath this an empty object. And this we're going to call our hand poser. And to do the hand posing, we're going to need to collide with something. In this case, we're going to do a sphere collider. And we've got a giant radius probably here, or a very small radius. Oh, we've got our gizmos turned off. That doesn't help. Okay, there we go. So now we can see our radius. So now whenever the hand will enter into this space is when we want to do this hand posing. And we're going to need to do this in scripts and with some more animations because we're going to use our animation blend. So to start off with, let's set up the animation blend like we did before, and then we'll jump into the code. So we come down into the hand, and we've got our idle here. What we'll do again is we'll copy that idle, and we'll set up a new pose, create a new clip, put it under our animations, under our hand, and we're going to call this point pose. There we go. And then we'll paste our setup from our idle. So that's our idle there, and we've got it all set up. So now what we want to do is, let's turn off gizmos because we don't need to see the camera or everything, is we're going to move this index finger back into the setup. Now what you'll notice is if we were actually not posing at all, so if we were simply in the output, in the base state, there's our actual idle there. But because when we go to idle, we actually cringe up. So what we'll do is we'll cut that and we'll make it pose. So if I press to record, I come into the index finger. Let's get some rotations going. We'll do that, and we'll come to here, and we want to make it relatively straight. So let's bring that there and that there. There we go. Now, if you ever look at your hand and you actually try pointing your finger out and you point it straight, it will never be completely straight. But so give it a little bit of curvature. There you go. That's the point. That's what we want. Right. Okay. So we've got our point pose. Now this in the animator will actually be, if we go to our base layer, just set up here, and we actually want to keep it in our base layer for this one. And what we want to do is we want to set up another parameter. And we're going to call this parameter point. Oh, no, that's a layer. We don't want a layer, we want a parameter. So we come into here and we set up something called point, and it's the float that we're going to be setting up. So jump back into layers, parameter point, and what we want to do is we want to transition out from here into pose and transition back there. And this is relatively the same way that we're actually doing our blends before. So if we come into here and we go greater than 0.1, and then when we come back out of here, we do less than 0.1. And again, remove that as exit time because we just don't need it for this. So that will bring us in and pose us into that point pose that we like. And we want our hand to be completely static when we do it. That's why we have all of the animations set up here. We want our hand to go into that point pose and not take any of these overriding elements with it. So cool. Let's jump back into our scene. So now it's time to code this up. So before I do that, we actually want to add into here the ability to go into this hand poser, this sphere collider. So to do that, this sphere collider, we're going to set this as a trigger. And on the hand, we're going to set a rigid body. Now, the rigid body on the hand doesn't want to use gravity because then your hand will just fall off the screen. That will be weird. It wants to be kinetic, so it wants to be completely controlled by our script and by our tracking system that we've got set up. Now, we want to do it so whenever the finger goes into this, it poses the hand. Now, you could set up a full mesh collider and everything else, but it's way too expensive. We don't need that. We come into the finger and we set a sphere collider up here. Now, obviously, our sphere collider doesn't want to be that big for the finger because it's a little tiny finger. So we come into here and we bring it in. Let's bring it, make it a little bit bigger than that. So we'll come into 0.2. Now, we also want to make sure that this sphere collider is actually in place. So we can see it's in the X. Oh, wrong way. There we go. So that's the finger. That's the finger point right there that we actually want to have this finger do its interaction. Now, when we build our full game, we don't want this finger just interacting with any physics object. And we don't want our hand touch points interacting with just any physics object. So we're going to set some layers on them. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to put the whole hand under a new layer that we'll call hand. So we'll set this to hand and we'll say yes to all of our children. And with our cube and the hand poser, we'll set a new layer called hand poser. And then go in and set that there. Now, in our project settings, we want to come in and make sure the physics are set up correctly. So for hand poser, we're actually only interested in touching the hand. And for hand, we are only interested in touching the hand poser. So hand poser goes to hand poser, hand and hand poser touch each other. Solid. That's what we want for now. Okay, so let's start setting up our hand poser script. We come into here, start a new C# script, and we'll call it hand poser. Let's open this up. Oh. Let's open that up. There we go. And again, we can get rid of all that. And we can start coming into here. So, get rid of this because we won't need it. Right, so the first thing we're going to need is we're going to need to identify what the string is that we pass to the animator, and that's the point pose, the point float that we actually take in. So what we'll do is we'll say animation variable to set, and we could call that animator variable to set. That'd be a little bit more specific. And we go string animator variable, and we just set that to null for now. Okay, and then in awake what we want to do is we want to do what we've previously done. We want to actually pass an integer, not actually the string itself. So what we'll do is we'll set up a public int hand poser ID, and we'll do get and set, private set. There we go, and we'll set that to -1 to start off with. And in here, what we'll do is we'll say hand poser ID equals animator dot string to hash, and then we'll pass in that animator variable, and that will basically pass this through the string to hash and give us this ID that we need. And this is the same thing we've been doing in here, where we know what they are ahead of time, but our poser might do different poses. You might have one that's a flat hand, you might have one that's a grip of a handle, something like that. So with the hand poser, we want to be able to set it on the fly. Well, we want to be able to set it per poser, and that's why we have the string. Okay, so let's go back into Unity, and we'll select our hand poser. Okay, here we go. And in here, we'll just type point in there. And that's basically going to give us the same as we have in the animator here, point. Okay, so now it's time to produce the code for the hand's response to the hand poser. So if we jump into hand, we'll go down the bottom, here we are. Okay, now we know we're using the trigger to set this off to get the hand pose. So if we come into here, we can jump in and get on trigger enter, and we'll need on trigger exit, because we're going to go into the trigger and we're going to come out of the trigger. Okay, and what we'll need from going in and coming out is an ID to set our pose to. Now, we might not actually have a pose ID, so we want to be able to set that as a flag to say, no, there's no pose ID actually set at all. Right, so when we enter, we're going to actually go in and collect the hand poser, and we're going to see if that's available from the collider. Hand poser. There we go, and we'll check whether that exists or if we've hit a different type of trigger. And then we actually want to set that pose ID to what the hand poser's ID is. So hand poser ID. Now we want to actually do the opposite when we leave. We want to remove the ID. So hand poser, get poser, and when we get to here, we want to reset this to null. Now, there's extensions to this. If you have multiple posers in the world, and you could have posers within posers, etc., you want to collect these in lists and make sure you're exiting the poser that you're in, etc. But for now, we've got the one marker, and we'll just keep it to this simple system. Okay, now, at the moment, when we go through the update, we collect input and we set poses on the index and grip variables on the animator. But what we want to do is we actually want to see now if pose ID actually exists. And if it does, then we'll set it. So if pose ID, if this has value, because it's a nullable variable, there we go, else we'll do this. Okay, and in the animator, we'll want to set that float to our pose ID and the value of that pose ID. Now, what we're going to do here is, for this demonstration, we're going to set this to 1. Now, that obviously is the extent of the blend. That's all the way to the end. If we were doing this as a full blend, like we do with these, we could set this to 0 to 1. And this would basically be, if we look in the scene itself, if when we're entering the hand poser, we start here, this could be 0 and we could move into 1. And that's what I do in most of my blends. If you ever watch the other videos on my channel, you'll see that when I reach things like guns or the grip on the turret simulator, you'll see that as the hand goes in, it actually blends through all the way to the end. It doesn't just blend continuously as it goes in. It's dependent on how close it is to the target object that it's moving to. So that's why I have this in place as I do. Okay, so we've got this here, we've set these up. But the one thing you'll notice is if we ran it the way it is at the moment, we'd go into the enter, we'd set the pose ID, this would get set in the animator, and it would go to 1. But, however, once we've exited and we've put this to null, we're going into these, but we're never going back on this one. We're never resetting this back to 0. So what we'll do is we'll come into here and we'll set it back to 0. And we do that before the pose ID leaves because we actually need that pose ID right here. And what we'll also want to do is make sure that pose ID exists. Because if we've got multiple hand poses in our world, we might have entered one, left the other, but we might actually not have a pose ID. So we want to make sure we have it, otherwise this will freak out when it goes through to process. So, back into the game. Oh, back into the game. There we go. Okay, so we have our hand poser. It's set up, it's got its point. It's set up with the correct layers. Let's check it out. Okay, so we're in the virtual world. Here's our hand with its animations, and here's our cube. And look, as soon as we go there, the hand starts blending through to show we're about to perform our interaction. And that's what we wanted. A nice blend into the thing and away. As soon as it leaves that trigger, boom, it returns. As soon as it enters, it goes into the point it's going to perform the interaction. So that's us interacting, but let's take it even further. We want to know when our fingers actually entered the cube. So we know we're about to interact with the blend that we just did, but now we want to know we're actually interacting with this cube itself. And we're going to call this cube a marker. And that's what I call them in the game. You can call it anything you want, but I stuck with marker. So let's change the name of this cube. Call it marker. And we're going to give this its own layer. Marker. And if I go into the properties, you've got marker here, and this would be filled out, but we clear it all out, so we've only got it interacting with the hand itself. Excellent. Right, so back to the scene. We move this to marker. Just for this, we want to keep this as the hand poser, and we want to make sure the is trigger is on, because this is another trigger item. Okay. Brilliant. So now we've got our marker, but we're going to have to code it up. So let's put in a folder, and we'll call this folder gameplay, and we'll add to this folder a script that we'll call marker. Excellent. And that will be going onto the marker object. Now, again, we could do this with lerps, encode, etc., but I like to use animations because it enables you to do more. If you were going to do a bounce, you could actually have it go to a pivotal point, and you could do those with curves, etc., and lerp through those. But you can also change the color and everything, and it's just easier, I find, to produce these in animators. So we'll add an animator to this, and we'll create a folder, and we'll call this marker. And we'll add an animator controller to this, and we'll call it marker controller. And we pass this to here. Now, let's animate this. So we'll start with an idle animation. And our idle animation will just keep the same scale that that cube's already had. And then we'll create another animation, and this animation we'll call highlight. And we'll set that. And what we'll do is we'll take the idle and we'll put that as the start, and we'll also put it around there. But in the middle, what we're going to do is we're going to raise this just slightly. So let's go to 0, 1, 2. So we're giving it a little bit of bounce. So as you can see there. So let's just play this. There you go. Fairly smooth, and you'll know that you're actually interacting with the cube when it's in there. And it doesn't go overboard with the bounce or anything. Okay, excellent. Right, now we're going to set up the animator. So this is still on the marker. We've got the idle and we've got the highlight. We'll add a ball as a flag, and we'll put highlight in here. And then we'll set up the transitions. We'll transition in. Let's bring this a little bit closer so you can see it. We'll transition in and we'll transition out. We won't bother with an exit time. We'll just go straight for highlight. And we won't bother with an exit time when we're leaving. We'll go highlight for false. So when we're highlighting, we go through. And when we're not highlighting, we come back to idle. Excellent. Right, back to the scene. Now, in our marker class, we get rid of this. Now, we're using an animator on all of our markers. So we'll say, yeah, we'll require the component animator. Excellent. Right, and we'll be collecting this. So animator, animator, and we'll be collecting that in our wake. There we go. And what we want to do is we'll want to set the highlight on this. So again, we'll be wanting to use the ID instead of actually passing the string. So here we go. Oh, animator dot string to hash highlight. There we are. And let's typing too fast. Highlight animator set ball. Okay, animator highlight parameter. We'll set that to true. And then we'll come down here and we'll just change this out to be unhighlights. Now we might actually want to see whether this marker is highlighted or not. So we'll just quickly type in to display flag is highlighted, get return. And we can take that straight from the animator because we know we're definitely using it. So we can take it straight from the animator and we can pass in there, and there you go. Straight from the animator, are you highlighting? Yes or no. And that's our marker class. Nice and simple. We save that. Now we can jump into the hand. Because again, we've got these trigger enter, trigger exit. So we can pull up the marker here. Do the same sort of thing. Marker equals other.get component marker. If we have the marker, then marker, oh, wrong one, marker.highlight. And then we'll do the opposite down here. We'll unhighlight it. Excellent. So now, going back in and letting the scripts reload, we have our marker. It has an animator on it, and it's set. So let's check it out. Okay, so here's our hand, here's our cube. We enter the trigger zone, we're ready to interact, and look, as soon as we're in, as soon as we're touching that cube, it's bouncing. It's been selected. It's been selected. So what we would do with this in a game is, if we were going to move this cube about, we would actually move the hand in, and as soon as we knew it was highlighting, we'd actually be pressing the trigger button at this point, and that we could then move around the actual world itself. And that moving around would just be more functionality that we would actually pass to the cube. So when we were in our trigger function, we would say, okay, the hand has changed position from here to here, move the cube in reflection to there. Now, the other thing we'd have to check on is where we were moving it. In the game that I have, it actually moves within a certain zone, but you could actually move it infinitely around the world. And that's it for this tutorial that I wanted to show you. We've got our hand, we've got it free from Mixamo, we've broken it away from its avatar, we've set it to blend on different settings, and we've made it so that our trigger and our grip buttons both perform 0 to 1 animations on the hand. And also we've made it so that when we enter an area, we blend the hand into a different pose to show that we're doing an interaction. And we've also gone a step further and created a marker that when we actually put our finger into, we actually show that that marker is highlighted. Now, the extensions to go through the rest of the game, there's quite a lot into this. We won't go into that into this particular video, but you can imagine you've got your triggering system built into there, and you can actually make it so that now when you press the trigger button, and you know you've got it pressed because you're actually receiving that variable, the mTrigger button, and we can say, okay, good, we've got the trigger pressed. Now, if we move the hand, all we do is we pass the corresponding movement into the marker and we move that marker about. Now in the game, what we do is we actually restrict that marker to the plane that it's actually on, and that's depicted by the box. But you could actually set it to move in infinite space. You could move it everywhere around. Other items is you could pick up the actual cube. You could pick up the marker and have it in your hand. And with that, what I would do is I would have a gripping blend. I would actually have the hand blend over the actual cube and pick it up. And you can see this in some of the other games that I've actually produced. There's an FPS video, and I'll set it here, that actually shows that when I reach my hand out to grab the gun, we blend the hand into the gun, and then I pick up the gun, and that gun is parented to the hand, and that's where we go. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video. It's the first time I've created a tutorial on this channel. I don't plan on doing a lot of these. I'm not a big teacher. If you want that, I suggest going over to a channel like Jason Wyman's channel, something I talk on quite a lot, and watching him. He does an awful lot of tutorials, whereas my channel is more devoted to how to design and how to build in elements to create games in Unity. So thank you very much, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you next time.